Book review. Book review today. Realistic. Idealistic. Idealistic, realistic. Idealistic, realistic, and optimistic. Those are three components that Dr. Joel Beeke says needs to be present in the preacher, God's preacher. And he says that here in Reformed Preaching, which I've found very useful. I've found very helpful. I've referenced it throughout, but I've really only really thoroughly read the first chapter. So, full disclosure, I've not read the whole thing. So take this review for what you will. It is a preliminary review. I just want to share my thoughts on it. But I very much so appreciate the work so far. I appreciate what Dr. Beeke is trying to do. In fact, I appreciate a lot of what a lot of men, what quite a few men are trying to do right now within Reformed academic circles, and trying to recover a doctrine of a robust doctrine of God, trying to recover the Reformed scholastic methodology of the way of doing theology, a right way of doing theology. This is a conversation, a discussion that needed to happen a long time ago, and ultimately it's going to be this kind of thing. This kind of resurgence in how to do theology rightly, kind of a recovery of that's going to keep us from tipping our hats to theological liberalism. If you ever go to the website, joshsummer.org down here, I just wrote an article on hermeneutics and theological liberalism, and I just talked to A.D. Robles on his show. If you want to catch that, you can go to his channel. I'd like to put that up on this channel as well. He sent me the recording to do that. But if you want to watch it now, go to his channel, A.D. Robles, on YouTube, and check it out. We talk about hermeneutics and how it's kind of blended in, how we do biblical interpretation really will determine what kind of conclusions we come to from the text. We can't just assume these things anymore. We have to acknowledge them, our presuppositions. We need to defend them. We need to argue for them, and we need to stick by them. God wrote the scriptures. God is the author. God is the inspirator. Okay. And we need to take that presupposition with us when we interpret the text. That's really important. So too, in terms of right here, Reformed preaching. You don't have to be Reformed to read this book and benefit from it. Surprise. And the reason why is because it doesn't matter if you're, just a 5-point Calvinist, wouldn't consider yourself Reformed or whatever. You have to notice that in our churches today, the pastor is really nothing more than a glorified motivational speaker, and that's how the congregations are not holding them to any higher standard. And so what we have is motivational speaking. Some pastors are really good communicators, but they're not preaching. They're not preaching insofar as preaching was supposed to or intended to be done from the scriptures. And that's what this book serves to outline and expand upon is really what is the goal of preaching? What is the pastor supposed to be doing when he's preaching, really? And come to find out, you read something like this, and then you just examine the scriptures and what it says about, what does Paul say to Timothy? Paul by no means entrusts Timothy with this light-hearted kind of menial task. It's a very heavy, weighty duty that Timothy has. And so we need to be asking the question, what are you, pastor, supposed to be doing up there on at the pulpit? What is the pulpit? What is that? What are you supposed to be doing there? Are you just delivering a message? We use that language all the time. Well, he's delivering a message. That's not it. Anybody, an atheist can deliver a message, right? A pagan can deliver a message. What is different about the task of pastor as he steps into his role of preaching? What is different about that than just going to a conference and hearing a theologian give a message, right? What is different? There is something different because the pastor is preaching not just to a random group of people that bought a ticket and showed up. The pastor is preaching to his congregation. The pastor is communicating with the flock of God, with those who Christ has entrusted to his care, at least temporarily. And that's a very weighty task. And so one of the things that Dr. Beeke does here in the first chapter is he says, the pastor needs to be doing, three things in preaching. And this isn't it by any means. There's 400 pages here. It's a decently sized book. But I thought it was an easy way to remember kind of one aspect of preaching. You want to preach the ideal. That's what the scriptures say. That's the commands, like God's law, for example. Those are the ideal. What are the ideals? What are the ideal dispositions that we need to have as Christians? Our thoughts, our affections. What's the ideal way in which we should walk in the light of Christ? What does that look like? What should the Christian life look like? You preach that, okay? You preach that. The perfect version, so to speak, of the Christian life. And often that looks like looking at Christ, looking at the apostles as examples and figures in the Old Testament. But then you also preach on reality. You bring reality to bear. So you have the ideal, then you have the reality. The reality is that we fall short of the ideal, okay? We're not always meeting the ideal. In fact, very rarely do we ever do so. In fact, when you look at places like Romans 3:23, for all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God, that fall there. It's something that we're doing continuously. And this is written to believers, no less. And so the thing we need to realize is that we fall short of the glory of God constantly. We need to preach that as a reality. And then we need to bring the ideal to bear on that. Where are we supposed to be? What are we supposed to be looking like as the Christian? We're a Christian. What does that look like? How are we called to live in the light of Christ? And none of this is devoid from very practical application all throughout the sermon, right? In fact, Dr. Beeke says application is best made throughout the sermon, not just at the last or at the end of it, but actually throughout the sermon. Your sermon is really to be steeped in application. Not only application, because you're preaching doctrine all throughout as well, but with the preaching of that doctrine, you're applying that constantly, always having an eye out for how that doctrine that you're preaching on applies to your congregation. This is a weighty task. This is a task we always need to keep in mind as pastors. But then also, so you have kind of grim picture of the reality, really, when you think of creatures and how we fall short of the glory of God. But then, optimism. Your preaching is to be optimistic because we have a good God. We have forgiveness of sins by the blood and righteousness of the Lord Jesus Christ. In Him, we are brought to God, and God looks upon us in a pleasing way, in a favorable way, because we wear the righteousness of Christ. It's a huge encouragement to the saints. That's optimistic. What else is optimistic, right? Well, when we partake of the Lord's Supper, for example, we look forward to when Christ is going to return. We proclaim His return. And in preaching, indeed, we should look forward. We should be encouraged to look forward to Christ's return. We should be excited to it, okay? And so you have these three components. I thought that was very helpful. A lot of preaching is either only optimism, no conviction, there's no reality brought to the fore, which is you are sinning against a holy God. Okay, that's not the comfortable part of the sermon. And people just want comfort now. They will heap up teachers according to their itching ears, right? And so, a sermon is either all optimism, right? Everything's fine. Don't got to worry about anything. This is a good life. We love Jesus, right? That's an example of that. And then, or you have everything as reality and just how terrible this congregation is, how terrible all these people are. No optimism, no ideal. You're just all terrible. And you all fall short of the glory of God all the time. There's no hope. Go home with tears in your eyes, right? I mean, there's churches out there like that. And, or it's all ideal. It's all the ideal, and which can turn into legalism. It can turn into a legalistic kind of way of preaching. If you're preaching law. This is, of course, the law is the ideal. Being able to keep the law and being without sin, that's the ideal. But the reality is we fall short of that. And so we need to address that. We need to address the congregation as they fall short of the glory of God. That's the only way. The scriptures do that, right? The text does that itself. Sets the ideal. You see Paul interacting with the Corinthians even. Paul has the ideal in mind all throughout the letter, the first letter to the Corinthians and the second letter. But he's bringing that into conflict with the reality of where the Corinthian church is, which is bleak, extremely bleak. At least, especially in the first 8 chapters, 9 chapters or so, 10 chapters, you might say. And so I just thought that was very helpful. Anyway, I have to be completely honest. I've been sitting on this book for the last, 4 months, maybe longer. I don't know when this book came out, but I got it when it came out. And Crossway sent it to me for free, which makes me feel even worse. Lauren Harvey, I apologize. Lauren Harvey is the person over there at Crossway that sends me all my review books. And she sent me this one a while back, and I still have it. So I'm confessing right now. So this is a kind of a preliminary review. Lauren, this is a review. I'm going to send this to you in an email, the link to this video. And hopefully this was helpful. I want to review other books. I want to review Maastricht's works that RHB, Reformation Heritage Books, putting out now. 2 volumes are available on Prolegomena, and then the second one is God and the Holy Trinity, I believe. I've read most of the second one. I've read all of the first one, so I would like to talk about that. So maybe we'll sprinkle some book reviews in here after all. Anyway, guys, I love to talk about the contemporary issues that we're experiencing, especially this social justice stuff, this critical race theory, intersectionality, and then to look back in history and to say, well, nothing really is new under the sun, and the tendency is in our sin is to undermine very basic biblical commitments that we should have as the people of God. And when we begin to undermine those things, error is more prone to creep in. We have to keep our finger on these things. We have to keep our finger on the pulse, so to speak. So it's nice to get a refreshing take on preaching, a historical take on preaching, what the pastor is supposed to be doing in the pulpit. Just like it's nice to get a historical take on biblical hermeneutics and books like Craig Carter's Interpreting Scripture with a Great Tradition. I'd recommend that to you as well. I will try to list these things in the show notes below. So if you guys found this helpful, please, after subscribing to this channel, I would encourage you to share it on your Facebook or your Twitter. I'm not on Facebook or Twitter, so I can't share it. So I would appreciate it if you could share it after subscribing to our channel, if this was helpful to you at all. Again, Reformed Preaching by Dr. Joel Beeke. Crossway publishes it. You can find it on Amazon as well. I'd highly recommend that you check it out, especially if you're a pastor. God bless. Have a good rest of the day.